Good evening. Thanks to everybody. For being here, and thanks to the Arkansas chapter of IFSP and for inviting me down here, and to the Clinton School for your hospitality. And thank you for that really nice introduction. So today, what I'm going to talk about is, I've been asked to talk about new developments in understanding, treating, and predicting suicidal behavior. What I'd like to do is, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the public health problem of suicide. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the context or psychiatric context of suicidal behavior and some of the work that we've actually done at Duke and before I came to Duke, when I was at my last institution at Wake Forest University, and how that set the stage for our current study that we have conducted, and we're finishing up with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And then in the last part of this presentation, what I really like to do is talk about the implications of our work, and I'm going to try to end up with some time for questions, and if they cut me off before we're done, I'm not going anywhere. It's a long way back to North Carolina, so feel free to hang around, and I'd be happy to talk with folks and answer any questions. So just to be upfront about any kind of potential I don't have any conflicts with this presentation, but I've received grant funding from those places, and the IFSP study in particular that I'm going to be describing was funded. This is a grant numbers. It was an investigator grant through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So basically, before I begin, I just want to get a feel for who's here, and how many people are from the how many people are here from the community but not associated with the Clinton School? Oh, fantastic. Okay, and how many people are providers, if there are any providers here? Okay, great. And how many people again here from the Clinton School? And there's some people over here. Oh, this is a nice breakdown of people. So I can have several different conversations with folks. But just to put this in perspective, an American dies by suicide about every 13 minutes. And from the years 1999 to 2015, approximately twice as many individuals died by suicide as died by homicide. And this is really important to note because, you think about watching your news, right? And how often do you hear about some shootings or some homicides someplace? And then how often do you hear about suicide? I mean, part of this is because there's a stigma associated with talking about suicide, which contributes to people not seeking help when they need this because of that lack of awareness. And but I just want to throw those numbers out there so you recognize the extent to which, we hear so much more about homicide, but it contributes to half as many deaths as suicide. Concern about suicidal behavior and risk is also one of the primary reasons for psychiatric emergencies and hospitalizations, particularly among kids. They're one of the best predictors of future attempts and eventual death by suicide. And suicide attempts are often markers for other undiagnosed but treatable psychiatric and substance use disorders. Sometimes people will say that they'll have the impression that suicidal behavior came on and it seemed like it was unexpected or it came out of the blue, and there were no risk or warning signs. But actually, the great majority of suicidal behavior occurs in the context of diagnosable, mental health issues or substance abuse problems. But a lot of times it's that people are not aware of that, and that's why it seems like it's coming out of the blue. And so sometimes when people are engage in suicidal behavior, unfortunately, sometimes it's the first clue to those people around them that they really are in need of some help and some services. So I have this, I always have mixed feelings about slides like this, but, at this point is that you always turn on the news and there are always discussions about money in terms of public health issues and the cost to society. So just to take the main cost of suicides are the tragedy to families and how it impacts the family members and everybody, all the loved ones, everybody that knows somebody that dies by suicide. And then suicide attempts, they also can be traumatic, not only for the person engaging in suicidal behavior, but also for family members, and not to mention the emergency room visits and the hospitalizations and everything that's associated with that. But there's a financial cost too. And the financial cost just for 1 year for emergency room visits, for suicide attempts and hospitalizations for suicide attempts were $610 million and $9.8 billion respectively. So it's a major issue in terms of healthcare cost to society. So, I mean, there's definitely, it's not an issue that should be overlooked when we're thinking about our healthcare system and how to provide care for people, because if we don't take care of this, if we don't prevent suicide adequately, you know, it'll come back. We're going to end up paying for this type of thing anyway. Before I go any further, what I'd really like to do is make sure that I just define a few terms, just to make sure we're on the same page. And in particular, I'd like to focus on the definition of suicide attempt. Several years ago, I guess I've been doing this for a while, but people define terms in a lot of different ways. And so it made communication among people working with suicidal individuals and among researchers, it made it kind of difficult, because when one person was talking about somebody who's suicidal, they mean something that's kind of similar but not necessarily the same as somebody else. And so one of the big developments, I'd say, over the last decade is there started to be some consensus in what people talk about in terms of the definitions of suicidal behavior, suicide attempts and suicide. So the definition of a suicide attempt is pretty much a potentially self-injurious behavior with evidence of at least some intent to die, and it may or may not result in injury. So there are a couple of parts of this I really think are important to note. Number one is it can be potentially self-injurious. It doesn't actually have to result in medical consequences. What's really important is the intent associated with that, as long as there was some part of somebody that actually wanted to die. Because sometimes, particularly when they're younger people, you know, they may engage in behaviors that they think might result in harm to themselves, but they actually don't result in any kind of medical consequences. It's not that that's not serious, it's just that perhaps that kid didn't have access to more lethal means or was not knowledgeable about, you know, what has greater medical consequences. The other thing that's really important is that sometimes we have this characterization sometimes that you know, there's some people that are really serious about engaging in suicidal behavior and dying by suicide. And then there's some people that, you know, they're doing it for other reasons or whatever, and we don't take these people as seriously. The fact of the matter is there have been many studies, many studies, showing both for people that die by suicide by looking at their psychological autopsy studies and looking at other evidence like their suicide notes and other information, as well as interviewing people that have engaged in suicide attempts, that is not that simple. That usually there's a fair amount of ambivalence and mixed motives associated with suicidal behavior. So for instance, there may be, you know, part of you that really wants is hurting so much right now, that is in so much like psychological pain that yes, you feel you can't really imagine any other way out and you want to die at that particular moment. That doesn't mean there's not part of you that really wants to live. You just can't imagine any way of persisting in the face of all this pain right now. And so you have, there's part of you wants to live and part of you wants to die. And the moment that you engage in that suicidal behavior, so part of you that wants to die is really kind of just winning out. And this is like one of the hooks into treatment when we're working with people that are suicidal, is trying to work with individuals to help them to step back from their pain and to help be there with them and work with them in a collaborative way to see how we can persist and get through this, so we can get to a place where we can focus more on our reasons for living and our purpose in living than hurting so much that we just want to escape at that point. So first of all, there's a lot of ambivalence. The other thing is that there are often mixed motives, and I think that's important to recognize. Because sometimes people say, well, they're just doing this with a younger kid, let's say. They may say, oh, this person's just doing this to get attention or something like that, and they take a pretty dismissive attitude toward that. And I think it's important to realize that just because, you know, there can be mixed motives, there can be part of you that does want to tell other people how much you're hurting right now or how frustrated you are. That, or for some other reason, you know, that they're engaging in this. That does not mean, you know, you can have more than one thing going on in your head at the same time. It doesn't mean that you're also not hurting so much that you just as soon die at that point in time. It's really important. It's not so much complicated as there's one group of people that really wants to die and there's nothing we can do to help them. And then there's another group that's, doing this for other reasons. It's much more complicated than that. And I think, by recognizing that there are multiple reasons why people engage in suicidal behavior and trying to understand what their experience is at that point in time when they're feeling suicidal, I think that's really where we need to be as clinicians to be able to reach out and try to help people and help get them through this. And suicide, the definition of that parallels suicide attempts, in that it's self-directed injurious behavior with at least some intent to die. So it could be part of you, just a small part, that actually wants to die. There could be that ambivalence, but it's that part of you that wants to die that's winning out at that particular point in time. So again, just to highlight the public health part of this, suicide is the green boxes, and you can see particularly for younger people, it's the third or second leading cause of death, or at least it was in 2015. And then overall, for all ages, it's actually the 10th leading cause of death. I'll show some slides in a second. It'll show that actually the numbers of suicides increase through adulthood, even more so than in younger adults, but then adults die of other things as well. So if you're looking at leading causes of death, it starts to go down the list a little bit. So here's the slide I'm talking about. This is suicide rates by age and sex. And you can see how it really, just dramatically, there's an increase from young adolescents through young adulthood, particularly for males, but also there's a lower increase, but there's also definitely an increase for females. And how it kind of goes like a mountain, and it kind of plateaus for a little bit, and then there's a bump around the mid-50s to early retirement years, and then it kind of goes up a lot. And so a couple of things to note. Number one, this is suicide deaths. And so suicide deaths really do increase, particularly in late adolescence through adulthood. It doesn't mean that they're not present at earlier ages, they're just not as common. The second thing is this used to be like one slope, like you were going uphill. There wasn't that bump in the middle around middle age years going to early retirement years. And that happened at the beginning of last recession, more or less, when people in the middle-aged to early retirement years started having had an increase in the rates of suicide, both for males and females. And then you can see how it increases really in the out years too as people get older. Now, the one thing that I don't have on this particular slide is suicide attempts, because I'm going to be focusing on suicide attempts. Suicide attempts are actually much more common in younger ages. Younger individuals attempt suicide in adolescence, many more times than, like, for instance, people that are older and like 65, 70, 80 plus or whatever, they're going to have many fewer suicide attempts per death by suicide in terms of a ratio. So younger people have more suicide attempts. And it's also the gender is completely backwards as well. So females will tend to make more suicide attempts, whereas males tend to die by suicide more often. And just I wanted to briefly throw this up, but just to highlight the fact there are also race ethnicity differences. You can see in particular the purple is American Indian populations, and Native populations is really very high during adolescence and young adulthood. And what's really important to note is that there's some American Indian nations where the rates aren't even elevated at all. So that what that really underscores is the fact that for some groups, it's literally like off this chart, for it to end up with rates like this, because it's, for some groups not to have elevated rates at all, and for it to end up with averages like this, it means that there are some groups that have just especially high rates. And you can see to a lesser extent some of the same pattern with females, but you can again see American Indians are particularly high during some of the earlier years. So just a couple of, I could talk forever, but I can't. But I'd be happy to answer questions later. But I'm going to say a few kind of generalities, and I'd love to come back to this with any kind of questions. Later on, so feel free to ask those when we get to that point. But suicide, Suffice it to say that suicide and suicidal behaviors are multiply determined. Everybody has their own path, their own story. You know, when you're in it, it's not like there's one group of individuals that are suicidal, and you can make a lot of generalities about it. Suicidal behavior is an outcome of a lot of different things that have gone on in different individuals' lives. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in the factors associated with and the developmental trajectories that end up culminating in suicidal behavior. With that said, some of my early work, and I'm going to kind of tell a little bit of a story here and weave in some research, is that one of the things I started doing was doing some longitudinal work, looking at follow-ups of risk for suicidal behavior. And some of my earlier work also focused on the context, the psychiatric and substance abuse context for suicidal behavior. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because some of that work sets the stage for some of the work that was funded by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that I'll talk about later. So basically, there are two longitudinal studies that I want to highlight here. One is the Great Smoky Mountain Study, which focused in western North Carolina and the mountains and foothills of western North Carolina with an oversampling of Cherokee, the eastern band of the Cherokee. And then we have the adjustment. That was a community or population-based study. The other study is adjustment of adolescents following hospitalization. And this was a study where we had a smaller sample, but we followed people over time. Again, both these studies, people were followed repeatedly over time from adolescence through adulthood. And this other study, they had been psychiatrically hospitalized, these kids, and then we followed them through adulthoods. And then what we did in the two different studies in two different ways is we looked at when people engaged in suicidal behavior, we looked at what was going on psychiatrically with them. So, like in the Great Smoky Mountain Study, if people had engaged in suicidal behavior, we looked at what happened in the last 3 months. This has been going on with them. And the second study, the adjustment of adolescents following hospitalization, we literally looked at the onset and offset of different psychiatric disorders. We did our best to kind of put dates to these so we could find out when people were starting new episodes of particular psychiatric mental health problems, and looked at the association between that and suicidal behavior. And the point I really want to make here in both these studies is there's no one presentation for people that are suicidal. This is young people going through young adulthood. And you can see here, this is from the Great Smoky Mountain Study. There were 11 different profiles that differentiated between people that were suicidal and people that were not. These are kids mainly. And you can see, I mean, there's pure depression, there's depression and anxiety, depression and disruptive disorders, alcohol, et cetera. There are 11 different permutations of these psychiatric presentations. So it's not like everybody has the exact same presentation. It's also, although depression is really one of the most common co-occurring conditions with suicidal behavior, it's also the case that not all suicidal behavior occurs in the context of depression. Even though depression is there the great majority of the time, it's not always there. And so that's just to highlight the fact that there are a lot of different psychiatric profiles associated with people that end up engaging in suicidal behavior. And then if we looked in the follow-up study of kids that have been hospitalized, you see the same thing. MDD is major depression. That's a very severe episode of depression. Dysthymia is more of a chronic kind of depression. GAD is more pervasive anxiety, a generalized anxiety disorder, anxiety in a lot of different areas of one's life. And you can see, and you can go down the list, but you can see here there are a lot of different disorders that are associated with higher risk. There's major depression, dysthymia, generalized anxiety disorder. Panic disorder is really important, and as a clinician, I can tell you, I give out my cell phone to folks that I work with, and sometimes I'll get phone calls from patients that are acutely suicidal in the middle of the night and everything. And when I talk to them, they're kind of agitated and almost in a panicky kind of state. And you have to be there with them and listen to what's going on, because they're feeling so anxious and aroused at that particular point in time, they can't really think clearly, and you just have to be there with them. And so it's really easy to see how the experience of a panic disorder is kind of similar to what somebody's going through at the point where they're thinking about killing themselves. Even ADHD or conduct disorder and substance use disorder are also associated with increased risk. So all of these psychiatric conditions are associated with risk. So it's not, I guess the main point here is that, to have a psychiatric diagnosis, there has to be either distress or some kind of significant functional impairment. And there are a lot of different conditions that are associated with distress and functional impairment. It's not just depression. And I say this to underscore the fact that there are a lot of different conditions that people have. And it would be really inaccurate to say that all suicidal people are the same and to put them all in the same box when we're talking about suicidal folks. I think, there are some commonalities in experience, but there are a lot of different paths in how people get to that point. So there's also a great deal of diversity in patterns or trajectories. Those studies were focusing on what's going on psychiatrically at the point that individuals become suicidal. But if we look over time, there are differences in how suicidal people are, how long they continue to be suicidal. And you can learn something about just kind of characterizing people over time, and that you can't get by just looking at that single point in time when they've made a suicide attempt. And so paying attention to those differences can help us focus in on what are some of the differences in these patterns, and maybe there are different ways or different approaches we need for working with different groups of people. So let me show you this. So basically, in our longitudinal study of kids that have been hospitalized, basically we had about 2,300 or so assessments, right? What we did is we started interviewing people when they were about every 6 months or semi-annually, tapered it out to 8 to 9 months, then every year. We started when they were 14 to 19. They're now finishing up the study and they're in their late 30s, so we followed them literally for like 20 years. And at every one of these assessments, we went back and we said, okay, let's rate them. What's the most severely they've been suicidal since the last time we talked with them? And we said 1, no suicidal thoughts. 2, suicidal thoughts, but no consideration of a method for hurting themselves. Suicidal thoughts with thinking about a method, a single suicide attempt or multiple suicide attempts. So this is the most severe since the last time we saw that. So everybody, if you've participated in, let's say, 15 or 20 interviews, then you're going to have a series of 1, 2, 3, 4s, and 5s for 15 and 20 interviews, and then we would use this over time. And then statistically, we'd use this to find different groups that had different probability groups of people in terms of patterns over time. So here's what this looks like. If you look at this, again, this is the kids since they've been psychiatrically hospitalized. You see that there's some difference. First of all, let's start with the blue, the bottom. This is a group of kids that have been psychiatrically hospitalized. Now, that's really important because that just underscores the fact that even if you've struggled with some mental health problems, it doesn't mean that you're suicidal. There's some people that are just, I think of everybody has a vulnerability to something. And, and those people, they were in a hospital for some reason, but it wasn't suicide or suicide risk. And so for some people that are just not suicidal, then some other groups that are really interesting, let's take the opposite group, the red group. You see this really high during early adolescence, and then it continues through. Now that group is a really interesting group because that group it has the highest levels of being in major depression, episodes of major depression, the highest proportion of time. It has the highest degree of hopelessness and the fewest reasons for living. There's a lot of anxiety in that group, there's some impulsivity, and it's also the one group that's characterized by having a higher probability, higher likelihood of histories of sexual abuse or trauma. And so that's one group that's really particularly at risk and continues at risk. And then you have a group, the green group, that's kind of decreases over time. Now, this is another really important group to pay attention to because they're actually at higher risk in adolescents, but they don't stay that way. So just because you're suicidal, there's an important lesson there. Not just because you're suicidal at one point in your life doesn't mean you have to stay there necessarily. Some people end up, and actually that's one of the larger groups. A third of the people in the entire study they were adolescents, they were struggling with suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior. By the time they got to young adulthood, they looked almost exactly like the groups that had never been suicidal at all. So some folks, they enter a different phase of their life, they have different context of what's going on, they have different issues, and things are really stabilizing for them. And then there's a smaller group that actually has a little bit of a different pattern. They start off lower, in adolescence. And then as they go into adulthood, they tend to have a little bit more problems, maybe some more interpersonal challenges, a little bit more impulsivity, a little bit more anxiety. But the important thing here is that, when we think about this, the way this works is that the way these statistical models work is that everybody has a different probability of being in every one of these groups, right? And so I might have like a 60% probability of being in the lowest group, but I may have a 5% chance of being in the highest group or whatever. And our key, the way I think about this, is in terms of thinking about treatment. What we want to do is we want to try to move somebody from from a probability group where they're at higher risk and try to decrease their risk so they can be in a lower risk group. So we want to change the probabilities basically, and that's where the treatment comes in. We want to intervene so we can change, like if somebody has a 60% chance of being in the higher risk group, we want to see what we can do to get them to the point where they're more resilient and not as risk over time. And that's the way I think about our challenges as clinicians. Now, this sets the stage. I told you I was going to tell a little bit of a story and how this led up to the IFSP work. So one of the things I noticed in here is there's some individuals in this research study that make many suicide attempts. They're not just one-time suicide attempters. And so one of the things we want to do, there's a lot of heterogeneity there, and that really underscores the fact that it's just not one intervention that's going to work for everybody, but it underscores the fact that if there's some people that have recurrent patterns of this, we need to learn a little bit more about that. And so we need to figure out what's going on and what are some of the mechanisms associated with that. So in particular, as part of that study, we also looked at the people that had just the repeat patterns of suicide attempts. And one of the things we noticed is that as people had a greater number of suicide attempts, their intent actually increases as they make future suicide attempts. Sometimes people will become dismissive if they know people that have made a lot of suicide attempts and say, well, if they really meant it, they may have died by suicide or something like that. The fact of the matter is, actually, if you ask people, they have more intent. The more involved with suicide attempts, the more suicide attempts times they actually attempt suicide. The other thing is like medical lethality. That is associated a little bit with intent, but first of all, medical lethality and intent are not always associated, particularly among kids, actually. There's a number of studies that say so you cannot make an assumption that just because a kid that ended up in the emergency room with very serious medical consequences because of the method they had, and then there's some other kid that didn't hardly have any medical consequences at all, you cannot assume that the kid that didn't have medical consequences had any less intent than the person that had the more medical lethality, because kids sometimes just don't know. They live with their parents who can discover them. They may not have access to more lethal methods. But we do find that the older you get, the more medically lethal your suicide attempts become. And then one of the more intriguing findings is that as you make more suicide attempts, the time until your next suicide attempts actually, if you average across people, it actually starts to shorten. So it's like once you've crossed that threshold, then it makes it more likely that you're going to continue to do this. And so what does this mean? It means that that we really need to understand why people are engaging and kind of escalating in their suicidal behavior. This is just a subgroup of people, but we want to interrupt this pattern before this gets even more serious. We want to understand some of the processes associated with that. So anyway, to make a long story short, there have been surprisingly few theoretical frameworks that have emphasized like mechanisms associated with suicidal behavior. But it's interesting that there's a disconnect between our theoretical models of suicidal behavior and the treatments we have. Because some of our treatments are pretty clear. For cognitive behavioral, some of the treatments that work. Some of the ones that have the greatest likelihood of working have been problem-solving kind of approaches, cognitive behavioral approaches like DBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention, for kids, a family intervention for suicide prevention, or the safety intervention by Joe Nasarno. These all have approach, they have some commonalities of like not only trying to understand what the person is experiencing, but also teaching skills, problem-solving skills, skills for coping with distress, skills for drawing out and encouraging alternatives to suicidal behavior. And these are all essentially behavioral interventions, helping people to come up with behaviors that are alternatives to suicidal behavior, or alternative behaviors that people can engage in when they're feeling suicidal or really distressed. And so that there is that disconnect. And so we started thinking about behaviorally, just from the perspective of like a psychologist, a behavioral psychologist, what could be some of the behavioral mechanisms that are going on here? What would drive you? What would be, and from the perspective of a behavioral psychologist, one thing that you know is if there is some kind of reinforcing consequence, you're more likely to do something in the future. But what could possibly be reinforcing about engaging in suicidal behavior if you're starting to do that more often, at least among some people? We started thinking about that, and there actually are things that you can understand, aspects of suicidal behavior that might be reinforcing, that might increase the likelihood that people are going to do it again. First of all, suicidal individuals often, they feel out of control about things that are going on with them. They're hurting, they're in pain, and there are things that they feel they can't control, at this point. And then sometimes focusing on suicide gives them this sense of control. And so, I may not have control over anything else, but I may have control over that. Yeah, I think it's illusion, because I think that people have more of a sense of control that they realize at that moment. But at that moment, you're in such pain, and you're only focused on the negative things that are going on in your life, that you have this sense that you can't step back from that, and you don't see that you have control. Another thing is that sometimes people that engage in suicidal behavior, they describe a cathartic effect, or a reduction in distress after a suicide attempt. And then the last thing is that sometimes when people are thinking about suicide, it's actually thinking about suicide sometimes allows them to not think about other things that are hurting them so much. So if you've just broken up with somebody, or you've lost a job, or there's a medical illness, or whatever it is that is a precipitant for your suicidal behavior that is hurting so much, is associated with your pain, it may be easier for somebody to think about what's the way out and how do I escape this pain than it is to dwell or to think about some of the things that are actually hurting them at that point in time. So what we decided to do, you can't set up an experiment to look at this, but we wanted to try to figure out what are some indirect ways of looking at behavioral approaches. And there are a couple of different ways we can do this. Number one is that you can put together these analog tasks where you can use particular kinds of stimuli and see how people react to these stimuli. And so what we did is we had individuals that had been psychiatrically hospitalized, adults. And what we did is we looked at three groups of individuals: people that were depressed but had never engaged in suicidal behavior, people that had made a suicide attempt and were depressed, and people that were depressed and suicidal and had also had substance abuse problems. And we did that because a lot of work we had started also to do was saying that people that are substance abusing and suicidal may be different in some qualitative ways and some fundamental ways, and we wanted to look at that difference. And then what we wanted to do was look indirectly at, we had some of these tasks. One of them, I will tell you, is called the AMP, or Effective Misattribution Procedure. But basically what you do is you would be exposed to these different kind of stimuli: pleasant, unpleasant. I'll give you examples in a second. Neutral stimuli, or stimuli. We didn't show anybody pictures of suicide, but we had pictures related to death, or kind of highlighting things that are similar to suicide, like a bottle of pills and things like that. And then we would see how people responded to that. And what they do is they show those images for a fraction of a second, and then you'd have a neutral image. And then what people would do is they would be asked to say whether or not they liked or didn't like the neutral image. And depending on what they were exposed to before they had the neutral image, they kind of projected that on. That affected how they rated the neutral image. And so we looked at that, and we were predicting there may be some differences between the groups, and particularly the people that were suicidal maybe have more positive attributions or ratings for images that may be related to death and suicide if that's been associated with some reinforcing kind of consequences to them before. We also looked at psychophysiological responses. which I'm not going to go into as much today. I'll just show you a slide showing you how to do that because the data were still pretty noisy and we're still looking at that. But there is a defensive psychophysiological response. It's an eye blink startle. If something comes at you like that, you blink. That's a defensive response. And if you've had a reinforcing consequence, you're less likely to have that defensive response. And then there's another kind of response called the postauricular reflex. It's a muscle behind your ear that's associated with appetitive or approach responding. So you're going to have stronger approach responding to things that that are typically associated with survival or things that have been reinforced. So you may, like kids, have a postauricular response to nursing, or it may be associated with food or sexual stuff or things like that. But it also, we were predicting if something has been associated with reinforcement, you'll also have a stronger postauricular reflex. So I just was throwing that out. That's another aspect of this we were looking at. And then one more thing we were looking at was decision-making biases. Because people that are at risk for suicidal behavior, a lot of times they seem to have a bias. They focus on short-term instead of long-term consequences. So, like, when you're really hurting, you're not thinking about, gosh, if I can just get through this hurt, your natural instinct. A lot of times, like if you put your hand on the stove and it burns, your instinct is to pull back and you say, And it's like you're focused on the immediate need to escape from the pain. And that's where somebody that's really suicidal is. And so they have this bias often for focus of attention on short-term versus longer-term consequences. They have a hard time stepping back and say, gosh, if I can get through this in some way, how can I can persist, and there are things worth living for. They're just focused on how much they hurt at that point in time. That's one of the challenges for clinicians. And people have talked about that. There's this guy named Ed Schneidman who's written eloquently about suicidal behavior. And he talked about that constricted focus. He talked about it as almost having people that are suicidal having this tunnel vision or almost this constricted focus on that need to escape, which is really a short-term focus. There's a word for this, it's called delay discounting, when people engage in a pattern of biased decision-making or more risky kind of decision-making where they're focused more on the short-term instead of longer-term consequences. It's actually what people that have some neurological conditions also have, like people that have like frontal lobe damage in particular. Sometimes it's also been documented among people with substance abuse problems, but they'll have much more focus on the either escaping negative consequences and having the reinforcement of that or going for positive consequences in the short term, and that outweighs the longer term consequences. So we also would look at the decision-making bias. One of the things reasons we're focused on that is if people have that particular kind of bias and looking at short-term consequences instead of longer term, that need that tendency to act on those suicidal thoughts, those suicidal urges when you have them, if you're focusing even more so on those short-term consequences that need to escape in the short term, it may be accentuated and it may be more likely. And so that's one of the reasons we were looking at that. So I'm going to show you how we did this. So we gave pictures of puppies. Now, these are some of the stimuli we use both in the psychophysiological task and in the AMP task, the affective misattribution procedure. And see, these are our pleasant stimuli, the cute little puppies. Here's another example, more of a romantic picture and everything. These are the positive valence pictures. Here, this is a neutral picture, the fire hydrant, the towel. Here's an unpleasant picture of an angry dog, or the angry person. And then here are some of the pictures associated with death or hinting at suicidal kind of themes. The bottle of pills or coffin. And here are the kind of neutral, remember, people would see this for just a fraction of a second, and then they'd see the neutral characters. And then they would rate the neutral characters. So it's just like a random Chinese character. By the way, we had to exclude people from our study that read Chinese, because the characters are no longer neutral, if you can read Chinese. And here's the psychophysiological work we were talking about. That's how we measured the startle reflex and the postauricular reflex. You can see where the electrodes went. And here's how we looked at decision making. We used the Cambridge gambling task, and basically what you'd have is a row of boxes. Some of them are red, some of them are blue, and then there's going to be computers hidden a yellow square under one of the boxes. And you basically have to make say, oh, is it under the red boxes or the blue boxes? And then there'll be a countdown. You get to make a bet. And you can see whether or not you want to make a riskier bet or a smaller bet as to how likely you think the bet is. And just to give you an example of how that looks, there's red and blue. You make your choice. And then there's a countdown. You can say 5. I'm going to bet 5 points on this. Of course, it's like a gambling task. The point is to try to get as much, points as you can. Again, those are the 3 groups we were looking at. And here's some of the results. You can see that basically this is the effective misattribution procedure. You can see that the average ratings were pretty similar for pleasant. This is the average percentage of people in those groups that said these were pleasant. And you can see for depressed people that made suicide attempts are about the same. If anything, the substance abusing people that were suicidal thought that the pleasant were even more pleasant, maybe a little bit more. The neutral, you can see they're about the same, but the same proportion of people were saying they were positive, those images. If you get to the negatives, you see the depressed people in suicide attempts were actually about the same. But what is really kind of striking is that the substance abusing folks actually had a very much lower percentage of people that said were drawn to those unpleasant images at all. And they were substantially different from the other folks that did the unpleasant images. And then you look at the death-related. The depressed people, about 29% said they were positive. We had predicted, remember, that the people that are going to engage in suicidal behavior, that have been hospitalized, that maybe there were some positive consequences that happened to them that are making it more likely that they continue to engage in suicidal behavior. And sure enough, there was a greater proportion of individuals that had suicidal behavior that rated those death-related pictures as positive. But then we had the really unexpected finding again of the substance abuse people, where they were actually rating them as less pleasant than everybody else, including just the depressed people. And this was really interesting, so we started talking with some consultants. I mean, on the one hand, our main hypothesis with just the substance abusing people was pretty much what we were anticipating, and even though we were using analog tasks, it was really interesting. It was consistent with a behavioral conceptualization. But the other thing is that thing about the substance abuse people, they really don't like the unpleasant images, and they really didn't like the death images. And it really kind of underscored the fact that maybe in that group, this is a group of individuals that really have much lower tolerance for distress or unpleasant experiences, which maybe you could theorize is related to them reaching out to drugs or engaging in suicidal behavior or whatever. But they seem to be qualitatively different from some of the other groups, and it's definitely something we're going to continue to pursue in other research. And then looking at the Cambridge gambling task, one of the things you could see here is that the risk-taking, that you can see that the overall risk-taking is a little bit higher among the people that engaged in suicidal behavior, suicide attempts, both the people that have substance abuse and not have higher degrees of risk-taking behavior. And so that part was kind of consistent with what we had talked about in terms of biases. So basically, some of the longer-term implications of this is really a line of research. On the one hand, it seems a little bit esoteric, but we're really trying to understand more about what's going on with people that it leads them to engage in suicidal behavior repeatedly, so we can try to figure out ways of helping to interrupt that cycle. And so the hope is that research like this and future research is going to help us to develop better or more targeted individual interventions with individuals. And in this particular case, the work with the substance abusing folks was particularly interesting to us, and we're going to work to better understand what's going on with them, because they have distinct challenges. And clinically, when working with them as clinicians, they really oftentimes they have greater access to methods for suicidal behavior. They often tend to be more impulsive. There are a lot of challenges when individuals have both substance abuse problems and the suicidal behavior, so we're definitely going to look at that more carefully to see how we can understand that. So here's some of the implications of this, then I'll open it up. I know I've gone a little bit over. but everybody's still here, so thank you. But some of the interventions is, I'm going back to the idea that interventions that have a problem-solving or cognitive behavioral focus tend, including that focus on coping skills for distress tolerance, tend to have promise. And I think that some of the things that these kind of interventions really do is help us when we are in that place where we are having those suicidal urges. And if I tell people when they've engaged in suicidal behavior, if they come into my office, sometimes they'll feel like they're freaking out if they start to have suicidal thoughts again, later on, if it's been kind of traumatic for them. And I'll say, if you've engaged in suicidal behavior, you're gonna have suicidal thoughts again. It's like, what's important to me as a clinician is not whether or not you're having suicidal thoughts. I want to help you get to the point where you're not having these thoughts as often, but what's more important is what we do with them when we're having those suicidal thoughts. And then that's really where the problem-solving interventions really help us. They help us figure out, or these cognitive behavioral interventions to help us figure out how when we're in that moment and hurting so much, how we can persist in the face of that distress and maybe figure out alternatives to suicidal behavior so we can plan for this and plan for the future. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a safety planning intervention as well. So here, this is you may not be able to read this, so I'll help you. This is a safety planning intervention that's developed by Greg Brown and Barbara Stanley at University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University. This is being disseminated and used in a variety of different ways. But basically the purpose of this is, when people are being suicidal, they're not thinking about alternatives. They're just thinking about escape. And not only that, your problem solving goes to crap when you're highly stressed out and when you're suicidal. You're only focusing, it's very constricted, you're focusing on one thing, one way out, and you're not really thinking about other ways I can deal with this kind of situation. And with the safety plan, you're also feeling very helpless. One of the things the safety plan does is help you figure out, A, what are some alternative ways, things you can do when you're feeling suicidal, and B, when you're feeling powerless, or if you're feeling out of control as part of your life experiences, it helps you, empower you to come up with this yourself, to be able to figure out what are things that I can do when I'm feeling suicidal again. So one step in this is to help us figure out what, as a client, what are your personal warning signs? When do you feel that you're getting so upset that you need to do something to help calm yourself down or to reach out to other people? When do you know that you're in the trouble area, if you're isolating yourself or having certain kind of thoughts or whatever? What are things that you have done, step 2, what are things you've done yourself that have helped to cope? What are things that you can do to help you feel better, whether or not it be, taking a cold shower, going on a run, distracting yourself by watching a movie, playing with your dog, talking to a loved one, whatever. What are some internal coping strategies? Painting, listening to some soothing music, journaling, anything. Social contact, step 3. People that may distract you during your crisis. This can be, you don't even necessarily have to tell people you're feeling suicidal, but sometimes just being around certain people can get your mind off of it and help reduce that intensity, that urgency to act on the suicidal behavior. So if you can go to a coffee shop or be around friends or something where people are having a better time, if you're in a place where you can feel connected to other people, it might distract you from the pain you're experiencing at that point in time. The family, step 4, who are family members or other friends that may offer help? And it's important when you're doing this is you have to identify more than one person, because somebody, plan A may not work for you at a given point in time. You have to have backups. But who are other people? And for kids, that may be a school counselor, it may be a youth minister, it may be a family friend, an older brother or sister, or whomever, not just necessarily your parents. Then step 5, professionals and agencies you can contact for help. And this includes the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It also, which I'll throw up the number in a second, it also includes Crisis Text Line, which is a new thing I just tried out. It's kind of a relatively new thing, and I texted the number just last week on my iPhone, and it actually does work. I got a message back, and it was connecting me to a counselor. And kids in particular like to text a lot of times rather than talk with somebody live on the phone, so it's really helpful. And then doing things what we can do to make the environment safe. The reason for this is that a lot of times people are thinking about suicide for a relatively long period of time, but there may be only a brief window of time when they're actually going to act on that suicidal thought. What we want to do is make it harder for you to act impulsively on those suicidal thoughts when you're feeling your most vulnerable. And part of that is helping you come up with alternatives for coping during that time. Part of it is for doing things to remove most lethal ways that you could use for trying to kill yourself in the home. It means removing firearms from the home, using gun locks, having other people. Sometimes, guns are very important to people, and because of safety issues or because it's part of their culture or anything like that. And so we can work with families to make sure they understand. We've done this with people that are in the military that are very reluctant to give up their guns. That's part of a culture. They've been trained to use this. And then, we help people to realize this is a temporary measure until we just get through this phase. So we're not as likely to have, easy access to a method, so we won't act impulsively. And then the same thing we do with medications and making sure that's locked up if possible. So these are all things to help us not focus only on the short-term consequence and have behavioral alternatives. The last thing I'm just going to say, because I love this concept, is focusing on hope, the opposite of what you're feeling when you're suicidal, when you're feeling hopeless. And one of the things that, as a clinician, I often do, and I encourage other people to do, is to focus on identifying reasons for living. And if people are having a hard time with that, that becomes a much longer process in therapy. But the one thing that's really helpful to a lot of people is develop something. And this is Greg Brown developed this as part of an effective intervention he developed for adults. But it's called a hope box. And with a hope box, you can start to put in tangible reminders of your reasons for living. It may be let's think a bucket list, right? It may be things you want to accomplish in your life, like you want to travel to Europe or climb a mountain or participate in a big race or go to college or learn a skill or have a family or whatever. Whatever gives you hope. It could be things that give you a purpose in life right now. It may be your grandmother gave you a Bible, or you won an award for something you had done that's really important for you. It may be a picture of you and some of your best friends or your cousins that you're closest to. It may be a picture of your dog. It's so sweet and is very comforting to you. But that's a hope box. Some colleagues of mine also, they'll put their safety plan in with that, as well as kind of a coping card, a reminder for coping strategies they can use. And the idea is this: when you're feeling really suicidal, all you're doing is focusing on ways out. You're thinking of how much I hurt and how much I don't want to hurt. And it's hard to think about anything else. But it's like your mind is playing a trick on you. You're only wearing dark glasses. You're only looking on the dark side. You're only focusing on one solution. When you have this, it's like you have these tangible reminders, something that you can pick up, you can hold, you can look at, you can hold in your hands. And that is much more effective at breaking up that cognitive set when you're feeling really suicidal. Those tangible reminders of your purpose in living, your reasons for persisting, than just having some abstract idea of things that I might be worth living for. And so I really love the idea of reasons for focusing on the reasons for hope and having these tangible reminders of that. So the last thing I just wanted to mention was the importance of recognizing trauma among some individuals, because one of the things, like in our IFSP study, a lot of times research leads you down unexpected paths. The substance abuse finding was an unexpected finding. The trauma is also, when we're in the hospital, we found, there's been a lot of research that says that histories of trauma or exposure to trauma is associated with higher risk for suicidal behavior. But I would say the great majority of individuals we worked with that were suicidal in the hospital had histories of trauma. And so that gets to our most recent grant, which is a collaboration with UCLA as part of a National Child Traumatic Stress Network, where we're actually adapting interventions for trauma populations with the recognition that sometimes there are unique aspects of trauma exposure that are related to suicidal behavior, because there can be things that remind you of, there can be triggers, the things that remind you of earlier traumatic experiences that can set you off and help trigger escalating cycle of negative emotions, or even the responses of others to your histories of trauma. Any of those things can set you off. And so we're trying to come up with ways of delivering interventions that can be very sensitive to those histories of trauma and very empowering and very focusing on resilience among those individuals and helping them to persist when they're feeling suicidal. And we'll just to end with some things that folks can do to help yourself, help as individuals, and the cause for reducing suicidal behavior and sharing and increasing awareness about this. One thing is to help through your participation in the Out of Darkness walks. I don't know if you've had yours here yet or if it's a little bit later. Okay, is become involved with suicide preventions locally through the AFSP chapter. The AFSP website has a lot of basic tools. It's actually a fantastic website. There's actually another website, if you're involved with suicide prevention activities, it's called the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, SPRC, that you can Google, and it has a lot of resources related to suicide prevention, helping to reduce stigma associated with suicidal behavior and help seeking, so it's okay. I mean, a lot of them, I think some of the current approaches to suicidal behavior are really focusing on ways of empowering people so that it's okay to reach out for help. Like sometimes people have this idea that that to be strong, we're supposed to handle everything ourselves, and we're not supposed to burden other people reach out for help. But actually, I help people to realize is that actually to be strong is knowing when you need to partner with other people, when you need to reach out for help to other people, and part of it is reducing the stigma so people are more reluctant, so they don't have this idea that here I have to manage this myself, that they can actually feel more comfortable maybe reaching out to other people when they're hurting so much. And here are the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. If you ever forget that number, all you have to do is Google it, and it comes up automatically, the word suicide, I think, and it comes up. And then the new thing is a crisis chat line, text line. There's a crisis chat line on the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline website, but there's also a text line where you can type in 741-741 and the word home, and it'll come back with an automated message that you're being connected to a crisis counselor, and it'll ask what the nature of your problem is. And so I'm going to start giving that out to everybody I know that's a teenager that's suicidal, because I've already have some of the teenagers I work with end up texting me instead of calling me because they're used to talking to people by text, not by picking up a phone and doing it that way. And then the other things that are there is when there is somebody that's suicidal in the home, it's just being there. I mean, a lot of times our temptation is to try to talk people out of it. And I think it's important just to recognize the pain people are in and just let them know we're there for them, and to listen and help in any way we can. And if somebody is we think at an acute risk, reaching out for help ourselves and taking steps to keep the home safe is something we can do. There's some other resources, AFSP website, same thing for American Association of Suicidology. So anyway, thank you guys very much. And
for those who have questions, please just come up after the program and visit with him. So we very much appreciate him being here. Thank you all very much for coming.